Richard was an extremely wealthy man. He brought his girlfriend Jen to a desert villa by private helicopter for a vacation. They were planning to enjoy a romantic getaway. Just the two of them. Jen was a supermodel, sweet and charming, with a stunning figure. At that moment, the pilot handed Richard a small pack of pills. He then turned around, got back on the helicopter, and flew away. The moment Jen entered the villa, she immediately began showing her irresistible charm. Early the next morning, Jen woke up in a great mood and started moving around. She listened to music while sipping water. When Jen turned around, she was startled to see a strange man standing outside the glass door. The man stared at her intensely. Moments later, another tall and muscular man appeared beside him. Frightened, Jen hurriedly called out for Richard to help her, but Richard showed no sign of surprise or anger. Instead, he warmly opened the door and welcomed the two men into the villa. It turned out the two men were Richard's business partners. They had planned to meet here and go hunting together. Richard introduced Jen as just a regular friend. Stan knew very well that Richard already had a wife. To him, Jen was simply someone Richard was seeing on the side.
Hi.
Jen quickly excused herself, saying she was going to take a shower. She turned and walked swiftly toward the bedroom. Her graceful figure as she walked away caught the attention of both men. Stan even picked up the half-eaten green apple Jen had left behind. He held it in his hand, as if the apple were a stand-in for Jen herself, something he had already claimed. At that moment, Jen was still lost in the illusion of being adored. Little did she know that in the eyes of these powerful and wealthy men, she was nothing more than a trophy. The four of them enjoyed themselves late into the night. When Richard went back inside the villa to grab more drinks, Stan immediately seized the opportunity to flirt with Jen. Meanwhile, Terry watched closely through a pair of binoculars. Jen did not reject the attention. In fact, she even looked pleased, because she knew Stan was also a wealthy man. If she built a good relationship with him, it might help her achieve her dream of becoming a star even faster. While everyone was chatting and laughing, Terry noticed a strange pack of pills on the table. Just as he was about to take them for himself out of curiosity, Richard quickly stopped him. Richard warned them that the pills were a powerful hallucinogen with extremely strong effects. To prevent any accidents, Richard turned and handed the pills to Jen for safekeeping. Jen walked back into the villa and tucked the pills into the pendant of the necklace on her chest. As the alcohol began to take effect, Jen returned to the poolside, moving her body along with the music. She invited Stan to dance with her. Stan was thrilled. The two exchanged flirtatious looks as they danced closely together. On the surface, it looked like she was trying to please Stan, but in reality, she was continuing to attract Richard's attention. At first, Richard seemed rather pleased, but when he noticed Stan's gaze becoming more intense, and even saw him getting a little too bold, Richard finally lost his patience. He stood up and interrupted the party. Then he lifted Jen onto his shoulder and carried her back into the villa, leaving the other two men behind. The next morning, the sunshine was still bright. When Jen opened her eyes, she realized Richard was no longer beside her. She walked into the living room and saw Stan. Stan quickly stood up and approached her, offering to help apply sunscreen. He used the opportunity to start bothering her again. Jen looked around the room. Terry was still floating in the swimming pool, half asleep from a hangover. Stan explained that Richard had gone out to handle some business and would be gone for the entire morning. Now the huge villa was left with only the two of them. Stan arrogantly believed that the dance from the night before had been an invitation from Jen. Jen sensed his intentions, so she firmly rejected him and said she would pack her things and leave. But Stan's pride was deeply wounded. He could not accept that a woman he saw as nothing more than a plaything would dare to reject him. Just as Jen finished taking a shower and stepped out, she suddenly noticed Stan hiding behind the door. Watching her, she quickly put on her top. But instead of leaving, Stan walked over and sat beside her. He then pulled out a business card and suggested she contact him sometime. Jen did not want to offend Richard's friend, so she reluctantly accepted the card. But when she rejected him once again, Stan grew even more furious. He finally dropped the polite mask. At that moment, the door suddenly opened. Terry stood outside, staring straight at the scene in front of him. Stan glared at Terry and told him to shut the door and leave. Terry calmly closed the door. He then turned up the volume of the television, as if trying to drown out the noise coming from inside the room. Time quickly passed until the afternoon. Richard finally returned to the villa. The moment he stepped inside, he sensed that something was wrong. He saw Jen lying on the bed, crying non-stop. Richard immediately guessed what had happened. He rushed out of the bedroom and got into a heated argument with Stan, because in Richard's mind, Jen was his personal possession. His friends could look, but they were not allowed to touch. Meanwhile, Jen, exhausted both physically and emotionally, soon fell into a deep sleep. When she opened her eyes again, she thought Richard had already arranged a helicopter to send her home, but instead, he handed her a bank account. He told her that a large compensation payment had already been transferred. Richard then made his condition clear. He wanted Jen to stop pursuing the matter and completely forget what had happened today. This way of handling things made Jen collapse instantly. Jen quickly grabbed Richard's phone. She shouted and threatened him to send her home immediately. Otherwise, she would call his wife and tell her everything. This action crossed Richard's bottom line. He cursed at her and said she was nothing more than a toy. At that moment, Jen finally saw Richard's true and vicious face. Ignoring the pain, she ran desperately toward the outside of the house. The three men immediately chased after her. But the cliff ahead blocked Jen's path. At that moment, her heart was filled with despair. Just then, the three men caught up with her. Jen knew very well that if she fell into their hands again, the outcome would be unimaginable. Richard stepped forward. He tried his best to stop Jen from jumping off the cliff. He even pretended to apologize, saying he had only acted impulsively. He promised that he would call the helicopter right away. In her moment of despair, Jen hesitated slightly, but the instant she let her guard down, Richard suddenly pushed her off the cliff. Fortunately, she did not fall directly onto the ground. A dead tree at the bottom of the cliff caught her fall, but unfortunately, a sharp branch pierced through her abdomen. Stan and Terry were completely stunned. They stood at the edge of the cliff and looked down, after confirming that Jen could not possibly survive. Richard warned the two of them to keep everything a secret, because no one knew about his relationship with Jen, and no one knew about this trip either. In this remote wilderness, a body would almost never be discovered. To cover up the crime, they decided to return to the villa first and destroy Jen's luggage. Later that night, they would bring equipment down the mountain to deal with the body. They planned to make it look like a disappearance or an accident. The smell of blood soon attracted swarms of ants. They crawled over Jen's body and into her wounds. The intense pain woke her from unconsciousness. She realized that she was pinned to the tree and unable to move. Fortunately, she noticed a lighter nearby. Enduring the unbearable pain, she used the cord of her earphones to slowly hook the lighter that had fallen not far away. She ignited the dry grass and branches beneath her. Before the flames spread too far, she used all her strength to shake her body. The branch finally snapped, and she managed to free herself. At that moment, the distant roar of an engine echoed through the air. Jen realized that Richard and the others had come to dispose of the evidence, but the broken branch was still stuck in her abdomen. The pain made it impossible for her to stand, so she used all her strength to crawl toward the bottom of the cliff. When Richard and the other two arrived at the edge of the cliff, Jen had just moved into their blind spot. When they saw nothing but a pile of ashes at the scene, Stan instantly fell into panic, because the whole situation had started because of him. He desperately tried to persuade Richard to call the helicopter and save her, but Richard insisted on finishing the matter completely and leaving no loose ends. Soon after, they each got into their vehicles and drove toward the bottom of the cliff. By the time night fell, the three of them finally reached the valley floor. By then, Jen had already disappeared without a trace. Richard and the others began searching along the blood trail on the ground. They thought it would be easy to catch up with the injured Jen, but the blood trail suddenly vanished completely by the riverbank. There was not even the slightest trace left. The three men had no choice but to split up. At that moment, Jen, who was escaping along the river, heard the sound of an engine again, so she immediately dove into the water. Only after everything became silent again did she swim toward the shore with all her strength. Excessive blood loss and the freezing temperature had already exhausted her, but when she turned her head, she suddenly saw Terry standing nearby. relieving himself. His hunting rifle was leaning against the rock behind him. Jen immediately seized this perfect opportunity. She quietly approached, picked up the rifle, and aimed it at Terry. Terry raised his hands in fear and told Jen not to panic. Without hesitation, Jen pulled the trigger, but she quickly realized that the gun had no ammunition. Terry immediately burst into laughter. He grabbed the rifle back and knocked Jen to the ground with a punch. It turned out this had been a trap he had set. Then he picked up the radio and informed Richard and Stan that he had captured Jen. After hearing the news, Stan finally let out a long sigh of relief. He even started playing cheerful music in the car to celebrate. Meanwhile, Terry forced Jen's head underwater again and again. Her desperate instinct to survive made her swing her arms wildly. By accident, she grabbed the short knife hanging at Terry's waist. After struggling for a few moments, Terry collapsed heavily into the water. Jen pulled the knife out and took all of Terry's equipment. She got on the off-road vehicle and continued her escape. Unfortunately, after riding for a while, the vehicle ran out of fuel. Jen had no choice but to abandon it. In the end, she hid inside a concealed cave. She started a fire and checked Terry's backpack. It was filled with useful supplies. The most urgent problem now was how to deal with the wound in her abdomen. If she did not remove the branch, she would certainly die. But even the slightest touch of the wound filled her with despair. At that moment, she remembered the hallucinogenic pills hidden in her necklace. Without any anesthetic, this was the only thing she had to numb the pain. She hurriedly opened the necklace and swallowed all the pills in one gulp. The hallucinogenic substance quickly spread through her brain. Jen's expression immediately became distant and dazed. In her haze, she picked up the knife. She cut open a beer can and placed a large piece of metal sheet on the ground. Once everything was ready, she sterilized the knife in the flame. Jen heated the metal sheet from the beer can over the fire until it glowed red. Then she pressed it directly against the wound to seal it with heat. Her agonized cries echoed throughout the cave. After a night passed, Stan was still sleeping in the car. Suddenly, a strange noise startled him awake. It turned out that Richard had returned after finishing his hunt. Both of them assumed that Terry had already taken care of Jen. Gradually, they relaxed and slipped back into their vacation mood. Stan stretched his arms and walked to the river to relieve himself. But just as he crouched by the river to wash his face, Terry's decomposed body suddenly floated up from the water. Stan was terrified and fell straight into the river. The shock pushed Stan into an emotional breakdown. He began blaming Richard, saying he should never have pushed Jen off the cliff in the first place. But when faced with the accusation, Richard simply threw a punch. He broke Stan's nose and forced him to calm down. Then he ordered Stan to continue searching for Jen separately. Meanwhile, Jen finally woke up from her deep sleep. She looked down at the wound on her abdomen and saw that the bleeding had completely stopped. The eagle-shaped scar was clearly visible. She picked up the hunting rifle and walked toward the cave entrance. But unexpectedly, Richard suddenly jumped out from the shadows and raised his gun to block her path. Jen woke up with a loud scream. Only then did she realize it had all been a nightmare. However, the hallucinations kept coming. It was clear that the hallucinogenic drugs were still affecting her. After struggling for a while, she finally returned to reality. Once she fully regained her senses, she realized that Richard had never truly cared about her. Their relationship had only ever been a transaction. Jen organized her weapons and resolutely left the cave. She was ready to begin her revenge. Meanwhile, Richard and Stan discussed their next move. They decided once again to split up and search for Jen separately. After the two men parted ways, Stan quickly checked his injured nose in the mirror, but he did not realize that this action completely exposed his location. While observing the desert from a high point with binoculars, Jen sharply noticed the bright reflection from the mirror. She lowered the binoculars and quietly followed Stan's vehicle, using the terrain to stay hidden. On a winding mountain road, she finally found the perfect moment. The car had run out of fuel. Stan stepped out without any caution to refill it. Jen quickly leaned against the rock wall and prepared to aim for a fatal shot. But the lingering effects of the hallucinogenic drug made her lose focus again. The shot only struck Stan in the shoulder. The powerful recoil of the rifle knocked Jen to the ground. After being injured, Stan staggered forward while trying to escape. In the panic, he even lost one of his shoes. Jen chased after him, but suddenly the blood trail on the mountain road disappeared. What she did not realize was that Stan had hidden himself above the rock wall. He waited in the shadows and quickly reloaded his weapon. After Jen walked a few meters forward, Stan suddenly jumped into the middle of the road. Ignoring the intense pain in his foot, he climbed into the driver's seat of the car. He slammed the accelerator and drove straight toward Jen, but when faced with the speeding vehicle, Jen did not dodge. Instead, she stood firmly in the middle of the road and fired several shots toward the driver's seat. When she approached the car, Jen threw Stan's body aside. At that moment, the radio suddenly came to life. It was Richard's voice. Jen did not respond. Instead, she started the car with a cold expression. She was ready to end this deadly hunting game once and for all. Meanwhile, Richard seemed to realize that Stan was likely already dead. He immediately drove back to the villa overnight. Then he quickly called for a helicopter to pick him up. It was clear that Richard was afraid now. Although he was completely exhausted, he still rushed into the bathroom to wash the mud off his body. He wanted to erase any trace of what had happened. Just then, he suddenly heard a strange noise nearby. Richard immediately grabbed his gun and rushed out of the bathroom. He began searching the entire villa, but from beginning to end, he did not see anyone. Eventually, he realized that the noise was coming from the pool cleaning machine. Just as his nerves finally began to relax and he prepared to rest, the television suddenly turned on by itself. His nerves tightened once again. At that moment, Jen suddenly appeared outside the floor-to-ceiling window like a ghost. As she slowly walked closer, a trail of blood was left behind in the hallway. She followed the bloodstains while searching through the villa. After checking every room, she returned to the living room again. At the corner of the hallway, Jen suddenly stopped. Richard was hiding behind the wall, waiting to ambush her. Sensing something was wrong, Jen quietly stepped back. She quickly moved around to the other side to prepare a counterattack. Because of heavy blood loss, Richard began to feel dizzy. He hurriedly wrapped plastic wrap around his wound, trying to stop the bleeding, but he accidentally made a noise, exposing his position once again. Jen thrust the knife directly into Richard's wound. After breaking free, Jen quickly picked up the hunting rifle from the ground. The revenge hunt had finally come to an end. Jen collapsed onto the floor for a moment. Then she slowly got back on her feet and walked toward the outside of the house.